So I remember years ago when I went on this journey to become a transformational coach and improve as a leader, there were some positive unintended consequences. I got a lot better as a teacher, and I mean a lot better. My classroom engagement soared, my relationships with my students bloomed, and it was just honestly an incredible couple of years as a teacher before I got out of teaching and started TOC in 2017. And I think that's one of the most exciting things about our work with coaches is how it helps them in other areas of their life, like teaching. Now, about a year ago, if I was completely honest, I had this kind of epiphany or this realization. Like I had figured out how to be an intentional and effective leader in the classroom and on the basketball court, but I hadn't figured it out as a parent. Now, I know I shouldn't be too hard on myself, as my wife and I, we were parenting in a foreign country, away from our family, in a small little house in Ireland during the pandemic. But nonetheless, I decided with a 5-year-old and a 4-year-old and another one on the way to make a personal commitment to the next year to not only be more intentional in my parenting, but intentional about my growth as a parent, to work with my wife to study better ways to parent and even get coaching, which I know I mentioned briefly in the last episode. We hired in February Dr. J. Nelsen's daughter, Mary, to help coach us on these tools of positive discipline. Now, in today's episode, I want to not only encourage you to think of how to apply positive discipline in your coaching, but if you're a parent, to remember, because I know so often I forget, that our number one job is to be effective as a parent. So let's start being intentional in our growth in that area of our life. You're listening to the Coaching Culture Podcast, and if you're new, welcome. My name's JP Nurbin, and I'm joined by my co-host Nate Sanderson. This podcast is about growing as a leader, not just in sports, but in all areas of our life. If you want to learn more about our support for leaders and our tools, head on over to thriveonchallenge.com. You can subscribe to our newsletter there to get the notes to this podcast as well. Now, let's get right into the second half of my conversation with Dr. J. Nelsen. So as we kind of shift to the second half of this conversation, I really want to discuss here some ways that we can apply some of your tools for parents and teachers, how we can apply those to the world of sports. Now, there's one amazing story I want to share with you, and that is of an amazing father, manager and youth soccer coach named Clint, who I support in my coaching mentorship program. He was having some trouble with the focus of one of his players on his team. And this young kid, he kept goofing off in team huddles, and the kid was interrupting him. Now, Clint, he had tried so many different strategies to help this kid stay engaged and wasn't really having a lot of luck. And he read Positive Discipline, and he decided to apply the mistaken behavior tool. So he pulled this player aside and he asked him, hey, do you know why you keep interrupting and being such a distraction in practice? And the kid, thinks about this for a second, and he says, no. And so Clint asks, hey, do you mind if I guess? He looks at him and he says, sure. So Clint says, is it because you want my attention? And he starts to nod his head and smile. And then they agreed that anytime he started to interrupt him or be silly, that the coach would just tap his nose 3 times to let him know he saw him. Well, this agreed upon intervention, it was a game changer. The kid was so bought in, he's so locked in, and his whole attitude towards practice changed. So I share that because I think it's a really cool story of how your work is helping other coaches. I know you have positive discipline cards for coaches, but what are some other ways that you see coaches applying these tools?
Yes, they're called positive discipline for youth sports coaches. But JP, what you just described is what Dreicher's called goal disclosure, mistaken goal disclosure. And the reason it's called mistaken goal is because the primary goal is belonging and significance. But quite often, children and adults have a mistaken idea how to find belonging, such as undue attention, misguided power, revenge, or just giving up. And so this idea he called goal disclosure to say, could it be that the reason you're doing this, just like you said, could it be that you want my attention? Or could it be that we're in a power struggle? and you're trying to show me that I can't boss you around? Or could it be that you feel hurt and you want to hurt back? Or could it be that you feel you just can't do it and you just want to give up? Because these are what he discovered was the four major reasons for misbehavior was the, undue attention, misguided power, revenge, or giving up. And but the thing is that when you do goal disclosure, it has to be very friendly. It can't be, well, you should just want my attention, or are you just trying to show me you can't, you're the boss? No, it's really caring about the child and understanding the goal and then being willing to give them what they need at that. Like, okay, I'll tap my nose. I just think that's such a lovely example. And if it could it be that you're showing me that I can't boss you around? And yeah, and they say, well, I can understand that. I don't like being bossed around. What could we do to work together so that we can solve this problem? So it's always, as we said, kind and firm. Connection before correction. That's a big positivism quote, connection before correction.
And I think another thing that I've just been experimenting with over the last year and a half or so, when we think about that connection before coaching or connection before reasoning or whatever the context might be, I think one of the things I've tried to do is lay out a pattern of my individual interactions with athletes where connection becomes the norm. And what follows sometimes is coaching and sometimes it's just a good job. Like I don't want their limbic system to start reacting when coach says, hey, JP, can I borrow you for 30 seconds after practice? And all of a sudden he gets scared because, oh man, coach is going to call me out for something. So he brushes off my connection piece. Hey, I thought you did a good job. And he's just waiting for the but, right? And so I think, and I don't know what you think about this, but I've really tried to encourage coaches that the more consistent the connection, the easier the coaching becomes. Not just those two things are married together in that one interaction. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And there is a big difference between praise and encouragement. And just to say, I'm so proud of you, that's really more praise. But encouragement is, you must be so proud of yourself. One is trying to look for me for validation, as the other is to say, boy, you really worked hard at that. Or to really encouragement is just helping them depend on internal evaluation rather than external evaluation. And I think that they need a lot of encouragement, and we just have to, and also I like to say everybody likes a little praise once in a while. I mean, I think every child wants to hear their parents say, I'm proud of you. And yet we have to just be careful if we're doing it so much that they look to us to say, am I okay? If they're looking for that external validation too much, then we've overdone it. Just like ice cream, a little bit is really good, but too much can make you fat and not be good for your body. So finding that balance, but mostly trying to draw forth instead of stuff in.
So I want to present a scenario that's a really common challenge for coaches, and that is, in competition, emotions run high, which is great because you want to see players competing and caring about winning. But let's just say any sport, referee makes a call, player doesn't agree with it, player responds poorly, then their effort drops, maybe they lash out at a teammate, coach subs them off, they come to the bench, they brush off the coach, they don't high five any of their teammates, just go over there and sit and sulk in the corner. So using positive discipline, how do we approach, this type of athlete? Because the old JP is going to say, hey, don't be selfish. Don't do that. I'm going to be quick to call them out on it. How might positive discipline help us there?
Well, here is where timing makes a big difference. Sometimes you just have to let people have their feelings when they're upset. And that before coming back to that specific, I would just like to say another real important part of positive discipline is that mistakes are opportunities to learn. And that we really like to say, this doesn't mean you're going to be perfect. Using positive discipline doesn't mean your children are going to be perfect, because we're human beings and we all get into our emotional state. And so for a child like that to later, but I also want to do one other disclaimer. if kids know you like them, you can get away with just about anything. Because you can make mistakes too. You can say, later, gee, I really yelled at you. I was upset. I'm really sorry. And I talk to my grandkids, and when they know their coach likes them, they'll put up with a lot. And so that's that connection part. And so it's just timing. And then later, when the child is the athlete has calmed down, to say, boy, I can see you were real upset. I remember times when I have felt that way too. And what did you learn from that? And can you think of some other ways that might help you to handle it a little bit better? So again, drawing forth in a way that's both kind and firm, letting them know that they do need to figure out better ways to handle it, but drawing forth instead of just trying to stuff in, because they know better.
And I wonder what you would say about this common coaching practice over the years. And that is, when you have a player that makes a mistake, again, whether they're late for practice or they're not giving a great effort or something of that nature, and the coach makes the team run and says, the team's not holding that player accountable. It's not my job to do this. It's your job to do it. And so the team runs while that player watches. And I was listening to a friend of mine, TJ Rosine, was on another podcast here recently. And he said, when I was a player, he played for his dad. And there was a couple of times where his dad did that to them or to him, where he would be the one that would make the mistake and he'd have to sit there and watch his teammates run for him or for his mistake. And he said, all it did was make me mad at my dad and, the whole situation. So how do you respond when coaches sometimes think, gosh, we just got to hold everybody accountable for one person's behavior? What's a better way there?
Don't do it. To me, that's blaming and shaming and punishing. And it's like, to me, I think that's just really too bad. And I think the coach needs to get some more education on how to inspire and empower kids rather than blaming and shaming. And that's a motivation. To me, that is the kind of thing. And it's a balance, though. I think that they can make a lot of mistakes if there's a bigger balance of being encouraging and supportive. But to me, to think that that's effective, that's the kind of thing that if there's enough of it, will just turn kids off of sports.
So another challenge that kind of coming back to your timing thing is when you're coaching a team, it's a little bit different. Maybe it's more like the teacher example than the parent example, because when you're coaching a team, one of the things that we're afraid of is if we let someone off the hook for this one little thing, it's going to become rampant in our team culture. So for instance, player shows up late to practice. Now I'm instantly going, I have to address it, or else what they often say is I'm co-signing that behavior. I'm saying that was okay. I really struggle with, Nate shows up late. It's the first time he's ever shown up late, but I know if I don't address this, then everyone might say, oh, I guess it's okay for us to show up late now. So there's oftentimes habitual lateness. I think I know how to address that. Those once off situations, like what's the best way for me as a coach to kind of address that behavior without it growing into something else?
A little earlier, I described curiosity questions just by asking, what do you need to do? And they don't really need an answer. They just think about an answer that the kid does. There's also curiosity questions, conversational. And I think that what you just described would be a good time for curiosity questions, conversational, which means you ask questions and you expect an answer. You wait for an answer. What happened? For example, you start, what happened? You were late. What do you think caused that to happen? How do you feel about that? How do you think it affects others? But and then you wait for the answer. And it's not an accusation. We call it curiosity because you're curious about their answers. And then the last one is, what do you think we could do to solve this problem? And again, waiting for them to respond. So it's again, there's so many tools that are combining, like that's part of drawing forth instead of stuffing in. Because lectures usually really just create defensiveness rather than curiosity questions invite cooperations, because I really care about what you think happened, what you think caused it to happen, how you feel about it, what you think others feel, what do you think ideas for solve it. It's a totally different feeling.
Jane, I know you guys have worked with educators and as JP mentioned, you've done some work for youth coaches as well. And I'm curious as to how you would encourage teachers and educators that pursue positive discipline as a way of finding solutions in their classrooms or with their teams. But when a child goes home to their parents, they experience a totally different environment. And oftentimes, as coaches, we might even get some negative feedback or resistance from parents because we're not being tough enough on kids or because we're not holding them accountable, as we've said before. There's just a weird dynamic there, when you're sharing responsibility for a child in a sport. What kind of encouragement do you give teachers and coaches in a situation like that?
It's always ideal if they're both on the same page, and it's not realistic. It often isn't. And the only answer that I can think of for that is that at least kids have been exposed to a respectful method of doing it, so that they know there can be a difference, and to have the experience of being treated with dignity and respect in one area of their life, even if not in all areas, that helps. And what we love the most, though, is when you get both parents and teachers on the same page, it can just be quite magical. As far as like when I did my doctoral dissertation, it was where we had two experimental schools and one control school. And in the experimental schools, the teachers were teaching, were doing class meetings, the parents were doing family meetings, and when they had family parent-teacher conferences, they would talk together about solutions and even bring the child in and say, what ideas do you think? Letting them know first all the good things that were going on. So of course it's ideal when they're on the same page, but it's just not always the case.
One of the more recent developments in my parenting challenges has been managing the relationship of my 5-year-old and 4-year-old. I get into fights and I really struggle with my role within that kind of disagreement. Within a team setting, there's often lots of times conflict between players. Somebody says something in the locker room, you weren't there. Social media becomes a big thing. A lot of problems between the players. A text might be sent. What do you see the role of the coach or the teacher, or even just me as a parent within that conflict between team members?
Well, is the same as with fighting kids in the family. We have what we call beat it, bear it, or boot them out. It's like beat it means you just leave and let them handle it, and that can be really hard when you're afraid that they might hurt each other. Bear it is you sit there and you just watch, but you don't intervene. And boot them out is saying, okay, if you guys are going to fight, you need to go outside to fight, or go into another room. But to me, I like the idea the best of saying, okay, we need some time out to calm down. And that's a big part of time out. Positive discipline is teaching positive time out, where your time out means you just need to calm down for a while. Okay, we need some positive time out. And then which one of you would put this on the agenda so we can work for solutions? Or to two of you, when you're calmed down, let's get together and I can coach you and maybe bringing forth your ideas for solutions.
I want to ask you one more question here. We've talked about connecting before coaching, and JP had mentioned an example before, of a player that comes out of the game and they're emotionally upset. And you mentioned, sometimes we just have to give them time to experience that emotion before we're able to start coaching them in that moment or, approaching solutions. I'm wondering if you have any other strategies for coaches when a player becomes dysregulated or their emotions have taken hold, because this can happen a lot, in little things and in big things. It happens in practices, it happens in games, it happens in the locker room. Like we run into this where a player just kind of, for whatever reason, loses their wherewithal to be able to reason through a situation. Are there other strategies that you give to coaches or to teachers or to parents to help that child to be able to regulate before being able to coach into a behavior?
Well, first of all, there's a difference between if it's a one incident just that happens once or if it's a pattern. And if it's a pattern, then that's where you need preparation. And that means some teaching in advance. And again, that might be using curiosity questions. What happens when you do this? What are you feeling? What ideas do you have for solutions? Coming up with a plan. And sometimes if it's just a one-on incident, just to validate feelings, boy, I can see you're real upset. We'll talk about it later. And then again, going through whatever they need to do. One of the things that I have been watching a lot of baseball lately, baseball season, and helping kids even see, what do you think of the athletes who have temper tantrums? What do you think about them? On the other hand, what do you think about those who just do it with grace? They're just such great more role models. And I just think to say, what do you want to be? Do you want to be a role model, or do you want to be an athlete that acts like a spoiled brat? Taking it when it's not them doing it, but teaching it in general, before or after, when you see something like that needs to be taught. So, and when you see it's a pattern, then okay, then we need to do something, but usually not at the time, not when people are in their irrational brain, but you have to wait till there's been a calming down period before you can talk about it rationally.
One of the tools that I love that Mary taught Melissa and I, and we probably use it a little bit too much at this stage, but is when they're having this really super emotional moment, is to just get on their level and say, hey, do you need a hug? For my 5 and 4-year-old. Oh, it works. And then it's like, well, hey, I need a hug. If they don't need a hug, then, well, I need a hug. And I would say it works 75% of the time, just us to connect and then us to be able to actually work through a correction. Obviously, I don't know if many coaches can drop down and offer hugs to their players. So do you, in that really highly emotional moment where you're worried they're hitting a locker or something like that, is there any similar tool that you might offer us as coaches rather than just offering our players hugs?
Well, let me know when you're ready for a high five. We can high fives don't have to be just for accomplishments, but it can be for controlling your behavior, for handling your upset. But just say, pats on the back. What do you need? What do you need that will help you right now?
It's cool you talk about the preparation part too, of just so much of that. I mean, there's the great story about Phil Jackson when he was at the Chicago Bulls coaching them. And there's a player, Tony Kukoc, who was a little on the younger side, and he used to get really emotional within games. And, he had conversations like this with Kukoc where they agreed upon like some sign language where they would, just a moment to remind him and just to bring him back and help to regulate him. So I think that's just such great advice that it's not just for younger kids, it's for, professional athletes at the highest level. You said you watch a lot of baseball, and I don't know if you watch many other sports out there, but you obviously watch some sports. So when this is kind of like a last question for you here, and I think you've been answering these questions so well. This I think might be the hardest question for you, but when you look at the world of sports and you look at coaches out there today, from what around, all the philosophy or psychology and positive discipline, if you could tell something and teach something to every coach in the world, what would that one thing be?
It would be to recognize the impact you have on the lives of these kids. I mean, that so many look back and say, oh, I was encouraged because of this coach. This coach gave me a lease on life. This coach was encouraged me and it influenced my whole life. And there are coaches like that. There are many people who can talk about how much they were influenced by a coach. I mentioned that Reed Maltby and I are writing a book that go along with these tool cards, and we have quoted many of these famous coaches who people remember because of their inspiration and their encouragement that have inspired coaches for their lives. I mean, athletes have been very inspirational to athletes and to others who hear about them.
No, that's great. I think the thing that was so impactful for me from the book is, I think there's almost all of us as coaches, we're inspiration to a lot of our athletes. But there's some that just are very frustrating. Their behaviors aren't there. They struggle with different things. And then you just give coaches a lot of tools, and parents and teachers, to help reach those ones that maybe we struggle to make those connections with and struggle to help, make those changes. I think it's that the players that are very, very coachable and, very dutiful, they're a little bit easier to sometimes, have that impact on. And your stuff is really, really good. It's not just impacting teachers and parents, but it is helping coaches. So I appreciate you sharing everything that you do. Is where can coaches go to learn more about you and your work and check out some of these tools that you have for not just parents, but even coaches?
Well, positivediscipline.com. And if they do the search for youth sports coaches, they'll see the tool cards that we have for those, because you may know that we also have tool cards for businesses called Empowering People in the Workplace, and for marriage called Keeping the Joy in Relationships. And the reason is because these are basic universal tools that work in all relationships, in all people, which is just treating people with dignity and respect and focusing on solutions and being encouraging.
So a huge thank you to Dr. Jane Nelsen. Parenting my 3 children this summer has been so much more enjoyable. I feel much more confident and equipped to support them through their mistakes and challenges. Please check out her books and her work. And if you're a new listener to the podcast, please subscribe and keep coming back. If you enjoy it, share it with friends, family, and on social media.